Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the weeds on a skill that's, well, become absolutely central in modern field hockey.
The drag flick.
Exactly. And this one's specifically for you experienced coaches listening in. We're diving straight into the biomechanics behind this really critical scoring technique.
Yeah, it's become such a massive weapon, hasn't it? Gives you options the old hit just doesn't.
Right. But what's interesting and maybe a bit surprising is how little really in-depth research there seems to be breaking down the precise body mechanics.
It's true. Lots of talk about it, but scientifically, less so.
So that's our mission today, really, to dig out those key biomechanical nuggets that you can actually take back to your teams, back to the training ground.
Make it practical.
Precisely. And we're basing this on a pretty smart study that did something clever. It combined what expert coaches think with some high-tech 3D motion analysis of players doing the flick.
Yeah, I like the design of this one. First up, they used what's called a Delphi poll. They got 10 experienced coaches together.
Like a structured expert panel.
Exactly, to kind of agree on what they felt were the most vital physical bits and technical points for a good drag flick.
Okay.
Then the researchers brought in the tech, a proper motion capture system. They analyzed 12 players, bit of a mix of abilities.
Okay, mixed abilities, that's good.
Doing 60 drag flicks each.
Right.
And under different instructions, which is key.
Right, let's unpack those conditions. So they had players aiming where they wanted, focusing first on being accurate.
Yep. Self-selected target, accuracy focus.
Then same thing, self-selected target, but going for speed, for velocity.
Right. Max effort.
And finally, the researchers gave them specific targets, again with the focus on accuracy.
Yeah, prescribed target accuracy goals. So they covered different scenarios.
And they used, you mentioned a 15-segment model and PCA, principal component analysis. What does that actually let them see in simple terms for coaches?
Okay, so the 15-segment model, think of it like digitally mapping the player's body into 15 key parts: limbs, torso, pelvis, head. It lets you track exactly how each part moves relative to the others. Super detailed.
Okay, so pinpointing the movements.
Yeah. And PCA, principal component analysis, that's more of a statistical tool. It takes all that complex movement data, all those joint angles changing, and helps find the main underlying patterns. Like, what are the biggest, most important ways the body's organizing itself to do the flick?
Okay, so it cuts through the noise and shows the core actions.
That's a great way to put it. It helps identify the dominant movement strategies.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's start with the coaches then at the Delphi poll. What kind of consensus did they reach? What did these experts agree on?
Well, one clear point of agreement was where to aim. The four corners of the goal: top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. No surprises there, really.
Standard targets.
But interestingly, they also strongly agree that hitting those top corners accurately is, well, significantly harder.
Which we see all the time, right? Those top shelf flicks are tough to execute consistently, but deadly when they come off.
Definitely. And they also felt that accuracy overall was probably the most important aspect of a good flick.
But they couldn't pin it down to just one measure.
No, that's the interesting bit. They couldn't agree on a single performance criterion. Accuracy was qualitatively number one, but no single quantitative measure emerged.
Which kind of reflects the complexity, I guess.
I think so. And it's probably why the researchers decided, okay, we need to look at both accuracy and velocity in the biomechanical analysis. You need both for it to be effective in a game.
Yeah, a super accurate flick at walking pace isn't much use.
Precisely.
Okay, and did the coaches break down the technique itself into phases?
They did. They identified 4 key stages, which gives us a nice framework.
What were they?
First, the approach to the ball. Then gathering the ball onto the stick, that crucial pickup. Third is the drag phase itself. And finally, the release of the ball.
Approach, gather, drag, release. Seems logical, familiar to most coaches, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it lines well with how it's typically taught.
And beyond the stages, they also identified specific attributes.
Oh, yeah. They came up with a list of 28 different things. Physical characteristics, technical points that they collectively agreed were critical for pulling off a successful drag flick.
28? That's quite comprehensive.
It is. It really shows the depth of thought from these experienced coaches, and it nicely sets the scene for what the motion capture data might show.
Okay, so we have the expert view. Now let's move to the lab coats and the 3D analysis. What did the player movement data reveal?
So they used that Qualisys motion capture system, recording at 250 times a second. That's incredibly high fidelity data.
Yeah, catching every little nuance.
Absolutely. And using that 15-segment model, they could really track everything. One of the big early findings was how the intention changed the movement.
You mean accuracy versus
Yeah,
velocity?
exactly. When the players were told to focus on accuracy, the kinematic sequence, the order things moved in, tended to look more like a push.
A pushing motion.
But when the instruction was to go for maximum velocity, the sequence shifted. It looked more like a throwing pattern, more sequential, using the whole body chain.
That's fascinating. So just telling a player be accurate versus hit it hard actually changes their fundamental movement pattern. That's a huge insight for coaches.
It really is. It suggests the nervous system organizes the movement differently based on the primary goal.
So drilling down further, what specific joints were doing the heavy lifting? What were the key joint angles identified?
The analysis highlighted several key joint actions that were consistently important across the board. Things like sideways movement of both hips and shoulders.
So abduction and adduction.
Correct. Abduction and adduction for both hips and shoulders, plus bending and straightening at both elbows and wrists, flexion and extension.
Okay, hips, shoulders, elbows, wrists, kind of the power and control centers.
You could say that. These seem to be the real drivers of the technique.
So understanding those specific joint actions is key for technique coaching. What about the outcomes, accuracy and speed?
Well, accuracy, as you'd expect, varied quite a bit. It depended on the task, whether it was self-selected or prescribed target, and also just on the individual player's skill level.
Makes sense. Not everyone's hitting the corners every time.
Not at all. But when they looked at the successful flicks, the ones that actually hit the target,
Yeah.
the average ball speed off the stick was pretty consistent, around 20 to 21 meters per second. That held true across the different conditions.
Okay, so roughly 21 meters is a good benchmark for a successful on-target flick in this context. That's useful data.
It gives you a number to aim for, yeah.
And the drag itself, the distance the ball travels on the stick.
When they normalized it to player height, looked at drag distance relative to how tall the player was, it lined up well with previous studies.
Oh, really? How much?
For the successful shots, it was around 1.45 to 1.52 times the player's body height.
So quite a long drag path relative to the player.
Yeah, it seems it's a kind of optimal range for that drag distance to generate speed effectively.
Interesting that different studies are converging on similar numbers there. Yeah, any other measurements stand out, like stance?
Yes, actually. The distance between the player's front foot and the ball at the start of the drag, and also how wide their stance was, these tended to be a bit smaller than what some older research reported.
Smaller? What might that mean?
Well, it could suggest a subtle shift in technique over time, maybe towards a more compact, possibly more dynamic or controlled setup, less stretched out.
Fascinating. Little tweaks in technique evolving. Okay, let's get into the technique patterns revealed by the motion analysis. Anything consistent jump out?
One really consistent pattern was the rotation between the upper body and the hips, the thorax versus the pelvis.
What happened there?
As players reached back to start the drag, their thorax, their upper body, consistently rotated anti-clockwise relative to their pelvis. So they create this separation, this wind-up through the core.
Ah, the classic stretch-shortening cycle idea, building up rotational energy.
Exactly. That counter-rotation seems key for generating power through the torso.
Makes total sense. What about the sequence of movement? The kinetic chain idea, big muscles firing first, then smaller ones, proximal to distal.
Right, the kinematic sequencing. This is where it got really interesting because there was quite a lot of variation.
Variation between players.
Between players, yes, but also depending on the condition, accuracy versus velocity again.
Okay.
That classic proximal to distal sequence, hips, then torso, then shoulder, elbow, wrist. That was more apparent when players were explicitly trying for maximum velocity.
So speed brings out the textbook sequence more.
For some players, yes.
Yeah.
But when the focus shifted to accuracy, the pattern often looked more like that simultaneous push-like movement we mentioned earlier.
Right.
And here's the kicker. Only a few participants consistently used that ideal proximal to distal sequence across all conditions.
Only a few.
Yeah. Which is really important for you coaches. It strongly suggests you should be rigidly enforcing one single correct way of sequencing the movement.
So don't just copy the textbook diagram.
Exactly. It seems players find different effective solutions. Focus more on the outcome, the effectiveness of their pattern, rather than forcing everyone into the same mold.
That's a really powerful message. Adaptability and individual style within biomechanical principles. You also mentioned some joint movements were very consistent, less variable. What does that tell us?
These likely represent the core fundamental building blocks of the skill. The non-negotiables, maybe.
Which ones were they again?
It was the hip and shoulder abduction, the elbow and wrist flexion extension we talked about, plus some specific rotations, right hip axial rotation and left shoulder axial rotation.
Okay.
The fact that these movements showed relatively small variation across players and conditions suggests they formed the essential foundation of an efficient drag flick, regardless of individual style or specific aim.
So for coaches, the takeaway is really nail the development of these specific joint actions in your players.
That seems to be where a lot of the core technique resides, yes.
Okay, let's bring in the PCA now. Principal component analysis. You said it helps find the main patterns. How did it add to the picture here?
Right. PCA essentially boiled down all that complex movement data into a smaller set of principal movements, or PMs, which explain most of the variation in the technique.
Like the main ingredients of the movement recipe.
Kind of, yeah. And the first few PMs captured really recognizable parts of the drag flick.
Such as?
Well, the very first one, PM1, clearly represented that whole initial action. Reaching back with the stick, lowering the upper body, starting the drag. Very fundamental.
Okay, the main overall gesture.
Exactly. Other early PMs highlighted things like the legwork, hip, and knee movements, contributing to the stance and stability, and also, significantly, the wrist actions.
Ah, the wrists again. They keep popping up.
They really do. The study pointed out that both left and right wrist flexion and extension were involved consistently across the first 5 principal movements.
5?
Yeah, which strongly reinforces their importance. It suggests that fine-tuning the shot, the aiming aspect, relies heavily on precise wrist control throughout the movement.
Okay, message received. Focus on the wrists. Essential for accuracy. What else did PCA show about differences between players or conditions?
It showed that the differences between, say, players going for speed versus those aiming at different spots tended to become more obvious in the later principal movements, PM3, PM4, PM5, and so on.
So the basic movement, PM1, is similar, but the fine-tuning differs.
That's what it suggests. The core strategy, represented by PM1, seems pretty consistent, but players make more individual adjustments, visible in those later PMs, to tailor the flick for velocity or a specific target.
Like adding their own signature to the end of the movement.
A good analogy.
Yeah.
And it even showed that players aiming for the same target area could still show individual variations in those later PMs.
So even with the same goal, there's more than one way to get there effectively.
Precisely. It underlines that individual variability exists and is likely functional even within a seemingly standardized skill.
This has been incredibly illuminating, really getting under the hood of the drag flick. So let's try and boil this down. For the experienced coaches listening, what are the absolute key takeaways from all this?
Okay, if I had to pick 3 big ones based on this deep dive, they'd be:
Go for it.
first, target area progression. Think about how you teach aiming. The experts agree, and a biomechanics support it indirectly. Maybe focus on nailing accuracy in the bottom corners first. Build that solid base, especially with younger or developing players, before really pushing for consistent top corner execution.
Master the foundation before the flashy finish. Makes sense. What's number 2?
Second, understand the accuracy versus velocity connection. Be really aware that pushing for accuracy might naturally make a player adopt a more push-like sequence, which could cap their speed, and vice versa.
So it's a trade-off.
It can be. So as a coach, you need to design drills thoughtfully. Sometimes you'll emphasize pure speed, sometimes pure accuracy, sometimes finding that balance for game situations. Your drills need to reflect the specific outcome you want to develop.
Tailoring the training to the desired adaptation.
Got it.
And the third takeaway.
Third, double down on those fundamental joint movements. The study clearly flags hip and shoulder and adduction, elbow and wrist flexion extension, and those key hip and shoulder rotations as the core engine. Really focus on developing strength, control, and range of motion in these specific actions. They're the building blocks.
And especially the wrists for precision.
Absolutely. Their consistent appearance in the PCA analysis highlights just how critical wrist action is for steering the ball accurately.
Fantastic. Those are 3 really concrete points coaches can work with. It really hammers home that while we talk about the technique, understanding the underlying biomechanics lets us appreciate and coach the individual variations more effectively.
Couldn't agree more. It's about guiding players within sound principles, not forcing conformity.
Right. So maybe a final thought for all you coaches listening to mull over. Knowing this now, understanding these core movements, the accuracy, speed link, the importance of wrist control, How can you consciously weave this deeper biomechanical understanding into your day-to-day training? How can you use it to truly unlock the full drag flick potential unique to each of your players?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Blending the science with the practical art of coaching.
Absolutely. Food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.